Hello, everybody. I welcome everybody to the fourth session now of our series of lectures called Den Krieg dokumentieren, documenting the war. Before I will briefly introduce our guest, Mykola Makhortykh, I will say a few technical things. After the introduction, Mykola will give a talk, and afterwards we'll have a discussion. I guess it's going to be a very vivid discussion because the talk is going to be very interesting. I already have seen the slides, and so I want to invite you to make questions. You can either write them in the Q&A register. I would rather encourage you to write it there, not in the chat, rather in the F&A register. And also you can raise your hand, and then we will then you can join us with video, which would make us feel less lonely. So I would encourage you to do that. Yes, and today the discussion will be in English, so there's no translation, just one channel. And yes, I will now introduce our guest. Thank you for coming, Mykola. Mykola Makhortykh is a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of Communication and Media Sciences at Bern University, where he's part of a project, and I'll just read that off because it's quite complicated. Don't mind me. It's called The Populist Radical Right Attitudes in Political Information Behavior, a longitudinal study of attitude development in high-choice information environments. That's a joint project of the University of Bern and the University Koblenz-Landau. I think one might say that Mykola, he's really like a research personality for the 21st century. I think he's he has several degrees. He's an all-rounder in history, in the humanities and cultural studies, and also in information and in computer sciences or information technology. His first alma mater is Taras Shevchenko University in Kiev. And then he continued his studies in Germany, Poland, and Amsterdam. Mykola is magnificently productive, I would say, publishing several articles each year. I will not mention them here all by title. As you will get some insight to his work, as I have seen, I will want to only mention those topics and research interests you're not going to hear about today in the talk. So Mykola is basically, if I understand his profile, he's basically working about how opinions are formed and how ongoing or historical events are framed in the web. And of course, a big part of building an opinion or forming an opinion is also searching. So what Mykola also researches or analyzes is actually what search engines return. So how subjects are framed by search engines. I think that's something we will not hear about today. But this is very important because obviously searching determines a lot the outcome, and we're not very conscious of of how the outcome is predetermined by certain information environments, and that's something which Mykola analyzes. This subject is also touches upon the subject of state censorship. Mykola very recently has co-authored an article on how Google and Yandex reacted to a Russian court verdict that tried to ban the search term smart voting ahead of the 2021 Russian parliamentary elections, which was not very successful, this ban, I think. a second field of research we will touch upon a little bit is how certain information environments represent traumatic and violent events of history, like World War II or the Holocaust. One of his more recent articles, one of Mykola's more recent articles, is called Audiovisual Tributes to the Holocaust on YouTube from 2019. And I also want to mention that Mykola wrote his PhD in this field of research about the relationship of online platforms and the commemorance or the remembrance of World War II. He finished this PhD at the Amsterdam University, I think also in the media studies there, yes. And since a couple of years, he's in Bern now, and now we're very happy to have him here in this lecture. I have to say that I sometimes really like my job, and one of the aspects is I like is like reading something which I have absolutely no insight in, and I was very fascinated preparing for this lesson and getting acquainted with what Mykola does. So I'm quite sure we'll have a great discussion afterwards, and I encourage you to ask questions then. Mykola, you have the word.
Thank you so much for the excellent introduction, Matthias. And also thanks a lot for Sylvia and the whole team for actually organizing this fascinating and very important series of events. It's an absolute pleasure for me to be here. And indeed, let me just go forward and share my presentation and then actually talk to you about what I'm actually planning to talk to you today. So as you can probably know from the program, and as you can see on the screen, the title of my talk today is Online Archives or Information Warriors, the Shifting Role of Social Media Platforms in Russia's War in Ukraine. And before I would actually jump into the more detailed discussion of the different roles the social media platforms play in this context, I would actually like to start with a slightly more general view on the general impact that social media platforms actually has in the modern warfare and the general relationship between social media and contemporary armed conflicts. So pretty much, I would expect that the majority of people in the audience actually are aware that social media platforms, think for instance about the Facebook, or if you're more into the Eastern European, especially Russian social media landscape, then about Vkontakte or Odnoklassniki. So these platforms pretty much play a key role in the mediatization of the modern voice in conflict. The reason why this role is so significant can actually be attributed to the several factors. First of all, we know from the existing research that online platforms, especially social media platforms, definitely help us to facilitate content production as well as the content dissemination. And in the context of the modern conflicts, it pretty much accelerates the way the conflict are reported to, both by the professional journalists, but also, for instance, by the citizen journalists or even the non-professional bloggers. But also it definitely increases our exposure as individuals and as citizens to the information about armed conflict. I definitely do not know how it was for you, but at least for me, before the February 2022, social media such as Facebook were pretty much, I would say, the place when I was primarily watching the funny videos about the cats. Unfortunately, it's definitely changed quite tremendously after February 2022, when I suddenly started really having a lot of war-related content popping up in relation to my native country, which is Ukraine. So it definitely shows you how the social media might actually expose you to the information about the ongoing conflicts, even in the cases when you do not necessarily want to be so much exposed to this information. Another pretty important feature of the social media, also related to the content production and dissemination in the context of the armed conflicts, is that it definitely also helps bypassing censorships, as well as collecting information about the ongoing conflicts. And you definitely can imagine a lot of different purposes of such information to be collected. But what we definitely recognize as, I would say, as a positive side of the social media impact in this case, is that it actually helps us to document human rights violations and war crimes. And if you would be interested, then you can definitely find quite some information online about about a number of projects which actually focus on using social media data in order to conduct such kind of documentation. Think, for instance, about the Syrian archive, which actually heavily uses social media data in order to trace a human rights violation in Syria. And I think that recently they also started doing it for Ukraine too. However, unfortunately, it's not only roses and unicorns, and we're also knowing that social media can actually raise certain issues and certain concerns. So in the case of the armed conflict, again, as you can guess, one of the concerns is that it actually exposes us to the content that we might necessarily be that happy about. Think, for instance, about really quite horrible videos of mutilated people who are murdered in the Ukraine by the Russian soldiers. Pretty much, it's not necessarily something that we might want actually to be exposed, but again, it's something that social media might actually expose us sometimes because it's the algorithm of Facebook assumes that it's something that is relates to our previous interest, sometimes just because it is random and it actually has a lot of likes. As a result, it also might potentially lead to the manipulation of the public opinion. We're definitely quite aware about this, I would say, dangerous side of the social media, and it's definitely something that I would be talking quite a lot during the lecture. And what we're actually having in the end is really quite ambiguous situation. But on the one hand, when we're thinking about the role of social media in the context of the contemporary voice, we definitely see certain benefits, but on the other hand, we definitely see certain concerns. This kind of really complex situation is really additionally complicated by the various technical affordances. So definitely think, for instance, about the way Facebook and Twitter organize and present information quite differently, starting on the kind of formats that are enabled on each platform and ending with the way you actually engage with the content. But also, for instance, the level of the independence, let's say, from the state censorship. And pretty much, as Matthias actually noted, state censorship is definitely one of the topics that we are working quite a lot together with colleagues, both in Bern and other universities around the world. And we know, unfortunately, that in the case of social media, there are definitely possibilities that some of those platforms are very disproportionately influenced by the certain regimes. Again, seeing, for instance, about the Russian platforms, for which are really very hard to remain independent, especially when Kremlin is really very intense in actually pushing against the media freedom within the country and actually trying to use this kind of platforms in order to promote its narratives. Now, we know all those fascinating things about the social media and contemporary voice. What is so special about the Russia's war in Ukraine? Why we actually argue with colleagues that it's really very important to look at this specific conflict. We're actually so interested in talking to you today about this conflict. And spoiler, it's definitely not only because the conflict is actually ongoing in my native country. It's definitely one of the reasons which affects my interest quite a lot, but I would actually argue that there are slightly more objective reasons why it is actually relevant, both for the societies, but also for the scientists. So one, I would say, important thing to keep in mind about Russia's war in Ukraine and the role of social media in it is the higher rate of the internet penetration in the case of Ukraine compared with other, I would say, areas of the recent large-scale conflicts. For instance, if we're thinking about the Syrian war, which is unfortunately still ongoing, then in 2024, we know that around 47% of the Syrian population is actually intensively using internet. In the case of Ukraine, as you can see on the screen, the number is actually quite higher. It is around 72%, which actually directly results in the intensity of the use of the social media for actually discussing, but also, for instance, documenting the conflict which is going on. Because pretty much when you actually have much higher internet penetration among the population, it very much results in the higher volume of the content, which can be actually used, I would say, to document the conflict, but also, unfortunately, sometimes to really distort the image of the conflict when this kind of content is actually used for the propaganda or disinformation purposes. The second reason why the Russia's war in Ukraine is really important to this context is that we also know that in the region of the post-Soviet countries, which is the case of both Russia and Ukraine, we're really having a rather strong digital market with quite distinct social media as well as the messenger landscape. So I would argue that it's definitely probably more the case of Russia, where this kind of market is really very strong. And we're also having quite strong regional competitors. Think, for instance, about Yandex, which pretty much in the case of Russia really plays a lot of functions that Google plays, for instance, in the context of the Switzerland or in the context of the Germany. But also we know that the way the platforms are used and also the choice of the platforms differs quite a lot in Ukraine and Russia compared with the West. And as we talked already a bit briefly, the selection of the technical affordances that characterizes these platforms actually affects the content which is produced there, the content which is spread, and it also naturally relates to the conflict related to the war. So specifically in the case of the Ukraine and Russia, we're definitely having really strong role of the Telegram, which I think has also becomes quite true for quite some Western European countries, but probably not to that degree. It is actually influential in the context of Ukraine and Russia. But also there is still quite, I would say, important presence of Russia-based platforms, even while in Ukraine in 2017, quite some of them were actually banned. And if you actually would like to hear more about this one, then just me some questions during Q&A. I definitely would love to talk about it more. Another reason which actually, in my view, makes the Russia's war in Ukraine quite special in the context of social media reporting and social media-based documenting of the war is really strong push towards more control as well as more censorship of the social media in both Ukraine and Russia. And we definitely can identify that this push is actually related to different reasons, pretty much also related to the fact that the political systems in both countries are quite, I would say, different. And trust me, in Russia, the political system is probably much worse than the ones in Ukraine. But it actually definitely affects how the social media actually used to document the conflict, or for instance, spread propaganda. And then another factor which is also very important to keep in mind is that we also know from the existing research, which is done also by quite some of my brilliant colleagues, is that there is really intense appropriation of social media platforms, such as, for instance, Contact, but also Twitter or Facebook, for actually propaganda efforts by different actors in the region. And in some cases, it involves human actors. Think, for instance, about trolls. Sometimes actually involves even non-human agents, such as, for instance, bots, which are pieces of the software which actually automated to spread propaganda very quickly and very effectively. But what is really important is that we definitely know that that both Ukraine and Russia definitely have this history of appropriation of social media platforms. And then we very naturally expect that it's something that would play quite a big role following the intensification of the war in Ukraine after the February 2022. And the last factor, which is also important, and that again kind of stresses this ambiguity of social media platforms, is even while we know that social media platforms really play a lot of I would say, negative consequences for the spread of misinformation and disinformation in the region. We're also knowing that they, at the same, also serve as a key element of countering state propaganda and censorship. And again, I would say that it's specifically the case of Russia, where Kremlin definitely puts a lot of effort to kind of limit citizens from the possibilities to express their discontent and also express their doubt in the activities of the authorities through the outer means. So pretty much the Russian citizens were really for quite a long time already, I would say, pretty much confined to the social media as a medium for actually doing this. And then it actually kind of raises really this interesting question of whether or not as a counter propaganda, or actually propaganda effort would be dominant on social media in the context of the war. And it's definitely something I would be talking quite a bit today. So we know all these fascinating complexities, and we know that we're already having certain expectations about the role of social media in the context of documenting the war in Ukraine. So what is actually the questions that we're still interested in pursuing with the colleagues? Because I definitely argue that there's still quite a lot of things we still do not know necessarily perfectly about the social media in this context. So we definitely know already that social media is important, and we expect the impact on the war reporting to be potentially ambiguous. But what we definitely know in class, I would argue, is that the implications of such an ambiguity, in particular for the non-Western platforms, because until now, we still, I would say, have quite a lot, we still have quite more research focusing on actually Western platforms such as Facebook or Twitter, and we don't necessarily have that much research dealing with the social media and messengers which are not coming from the Western companies. And again, here I'm thinking, for instance, about the Kontakty or Odnoklassniki, but also, for instance, the Telegram of Pavel Durov. Again, from existing research, we can expect that these platforms might perform multiple roles, and quite some of those roles I will be discussing today. And these roles will likely vary from documenting the violence to actually amplifying the Kremlin's narrative about the justification and the importance of the war in Ukraine. But as I noted, the empirical investigations of these roles remain relatively few, and it's definitely something that we think are really important to actually do more. And the reason why such investigations are actually important, in our opinion, is that it definitely would help us to achieve better understanding of how these platforms can actually be used, but also misused in the context of Russia's war in Ukraine, and also how they shall be treated by the academics as well as general publics, because I think that we're definitely having quite a lot of debates about how we should actually deal with those platforms, how we actually should regulate these platforms, and how we can actually treat them both as academics, but also as citizens. Now, it was quite a lengthy introduction, and now we can actually go to some findings. So pretty much, as Matthias also kindly noted, I definitely was working on the subject of social media in the context of the Ukraine and Russia for quite some time. And you can see quite some studies that we published over the recent years together with my brilliant colleagues on the topic. And pretty much what I would actually say is that very roughly, these studies that we actually worked on definitely demonstrate a range of different roles which social media platforms adopt, I would say primarily in the context of the war in Ukraine, both before 2022 and also unfortunately after 2022. So pretty much what we argue in those studies is that platforms can really play a lot of different roles. They can serve as online archives, they can actually serve as a memory battlegrounds. Sometimes they can even be used as a digital border makers or echo chambers. And it's definitely, unfortunately, also playing the role of the hate speech amplifiers and information warriors. What I would be focusing today in this talk is actually two functions. So first of all, online archives, which I would kind of expect because pretty much the series is very much focused on the documenting the war in Ukraine and the role of social media in it, as well as the information warriors. And if you would be interested in other functions, and again, definitely ask me the questions during Q&A. I would be very glad to actually talk more about some other functionalities that actually would not be focusing on today. So let us actually talk about the first functionality, which is the role of social media as online archives. What I find really interesting about this specific perspective is that we're definitely having the ongoing debate for quite some time about whether or not social media can actually be viewed as archives. I personally am leaning towards the side that actually says that yes, we can actually conceptualize social media as archives in themselves. Of course, it probably would be quite special types of the archives, so they're definitely quite different from the traditional archives. And if you was actually doing traditional archival work, you probably can very quickly notice the difference between the traditional archive and, for instance, the Facebook or, for instance, the Twitter. But what Beer and Boris argue in a very nice article, which I highly recommend, is that social media can actually be viewed as, for instance, the archives of the everyday, or the archives that actually contain and preserve certain opinions on the broad range of issues, ranging from the political issues and ending with, I would say, very personal issues. In the context of the contemporary voice, we know that social media are really important in this sense because they accumulate quite unique materials which don't necessarily go beyond traditional archival collections. And again, I would say that my view on the archives might be a bit outdated because I think that the last time I was actually working professionally in the archive was around a decade ago. But I would say that, at least in my understanding, quite some things that we actually seeing on the social media platforms and which actually, in my view, constitute quite important archival materials are not necessarily still going to the traditional archives, even though the situation is probably changing gradually. Some of those examples that I can think about, for instance, are related to the digital-born evidence of the ongoing war. Think, for instance, the action cam recordings on the screens of the people who are actually participating in the warfare. Then you can, for instance, think about the smartphone photos, which again done either during the war action or actually after the certain place was liberated or occupied. You can also think, for instance, about the vlogs of citizen journalists, but unfortunately propagandists, and we definitely having quite a lot of propagandists who are using social media to actually spread propaganda. And then you can, for instance, think about the online debates and comments, which sometimes are kind of thought about something that is not really important or essential, but at the same time, I still would argue that it's something that might actually be quite relevant to archive and also study, and I also would give some examples. What such materials actually offer in the context of a modern warfare is that definitely a different and potentially less elite-driven interpretation of the war. Because again, if you are familiar with the I would say, notion of the archive as well as the critiques of the traditional archives, which I'm pretty sure there's a majority of people are likely familiar here even more than me. Then there is definitely quite a lot of debate about the tendency of the traditional archives to actually focus on quite elite-driven interpretations of the past, be it, for instance, the war, or be it another type of the political process. And what social media definitely offer us as researchers in this context as new possibilities for actually studying the different aspects of the war, which is not necessarily focused on the political elites, such as politicians, presidents, or the generals, but actually citizens like you and me who actually experience the war firsthand and experience the sufferings, which then can be documented using the social media. And as already noted in the very beginning, the particular importance of social media in this case is definitely relates to their potential for identifying human rights violations and war crimes. And I again highly recommend you to actually Google the Syrian archive and actually read a bit about the functionality of this fascinating organization. Now, again, it's kind of a nice theory, but what we're actually seeing when we're actually trying to apply the theory of social media serving as a form of an archive to actual empirical reality of their use in the context of the war in Ukraine, as well as research that we are conducting on the war in Ukraine. So pretty much one of, I would say, main challenges of actually looking at social media platforms as a way of documenting the past as well as very recent present is that despite them functioning as some form of the archive, these platforms are definitely not necessarily intended by design to be archives in the usual sense of the word. And pretty much, I would say that one of the main issues here is that on the one hand, social media platforms are highly accessible. It's definitely relatively easy to produce content on the social media and then spread it through your network. But at the same time, we're also having a situation when we're often lacking tools for proper attribution of the social media items, which is definitely one of the big benefits of the traditional archival institutions, which actually give a rich amount of attributions for the researchers. And this kind of lack of tools for the proper attribution of the type of the item, which is, for instance, uploaded, how reliable is the interpretation is promoted, whether or not it's not actually totally fake who actually uploaded this kind of item, raises a number of issues and questions, and I would actually briefly talk about some of those. So one of the issues that we actually find quite important in this case relates to the divergent interpretations of the ongoing events and the quite high choice that we actually having to make, both again as the researchers, but also as the citizens, about which interpretations actually to trust. Here's one of the examples, which is really a very powerful example. And this nice graph actually comes from the research that I was conducting together with my excellent colleague, Marina Sidorova. And during this particular study, what we did, we actually looked at the images related to the war in Ukraine during its first hot phase in summer 2014. And the presence of images with specific features in the two Vkontakte communities. And just very fast recap, if you don't know what Vkontakte is, then just think about it as a Russian analog of Facebook. It's really very similar in many senses. It probably has a bit more horrible design than Facebook, but other than that, it actually gives you the idea. So what we did for this study, we actually collected quite a big number of images representing the war in Ukraine in summer 2014, coming from a pro-Ukrainian Vkontakte group and then pro-Russian Vkontakte group. And then what we did together with Marina, we actually labeled those images using the visual content analysis in order to identify what are the main features that these images are actually focusing on. What you can see on the screen is that there are definitely some similarities in how the two groups actually use different images to represent the war, but there are also definitely quite some, I would say, important differences. Probably one really important difference that is probably one which is the most noticeable one relates to the emphasis in the pro-Ukrainian group on the images of the combatants. So basically, really a lot of content in the pro-Ukrainian group in 2014 was really very much focused on the representation of the ongoing war through the prism of actually showing the glory of our Ukrainian boys. You're basically having a lot of images of the handsome Ukrainian soldiers really wearing some nice armor, having some nice guns in their hands, which was, I would say, a bit more on the side of the whole, how Hollywood usually represents the war. In the case of the pro-Russian community, the image was really quite different. As you can see on the screen, the strong emphasis was really on the images of the ruinations, the destructions, and the human suffering. And if you're interested what actually attributed to this distribution, definitely ask me some questions, but it actually shows you how different can be the set of, let's say, documents which actually produced on social media in relation to the war. And also, if you're interested in how the situation would look like for this current period, not the 2014 and 2020, then just based on my very short anecdotal evidence, I would say that it would be very much reverse. And again, if you would have more questions in terms of this specific study, definitely just ask. So the first issue is that we're definitely having very different kind of documents with very different semantic meaning behind them when we're looking on the social media. However, it's definitely not the only problem. The second issue that we also find quite challenging is that when we're actually looking at the war-related content on social media, then we're definitely having a lot of instances of the hate speech and dehumanization. And it very much raises, I would say, both research-related questions, but also ethic-related questions. So what we're actually doing with this kind of content. And here are just some of the examples. These are really unpleasant images. They're also highly unpleasant for me as a Ukrainian because these images are pretty much focusing on actually dehumanizing Ukrainians. If you do not read Ukrainian or Russian, then I can just quickly tell you what is written there. So basically on the very top image, it actually says the Ukrainian on the Russian forest. The expectation is nice. The reality is definitely a peak according to the Russian propagandists who are spreading this kind of image. And then, for instance, the image in the right bottom says glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes. So this very important and very known motto of Ukrainians. And it's again kind of put together with the images of the peak. So very much this kind of content is currently very present on the social media. And pretty much as you can guess from this kind of horrible images, the main purpose of this content is actually to dehumanize Ukrainians. And again, if you would be interested more in listening more about the purpose of this kind of dehumanization, as well as how it actually made, just ask me some Q&As. But pretty much I would say that the dehumanization is really important part of the war, especially on the Ukrainian side, on the Russian side. And then pretty much, as I said, it really raises quite a difficult ethical question. So on the one hand, this kind of terrible content is definitely not something that we would like to see, and not necessarily something that is actually worth having on the social media platforms, because this is really horrible content. But on the other hand, it might actually be important for documenting the war, because without this content, we would not necessarily understand the logic behind the Russian propaganda and the way it actually uses social media in order to dehumanize its opponents. And the third issue that I would actually like to talk briefly about is actually another challenge, which is related to the conceptualization of the social media as an online archive, which is definitely relates to another fascinating feature of the social media, namely its possibility to actually being used to remix and also modify the content. And on the one hand, it definitely allows us to make some very creative uses of social media. But on the other hand, it also raises quite a lot of questions. For instance, you're really having a lot of content right now, which actually bridges Second World War and Russia's war in Ukraine, especially on the Russia side again. And then it raises the question, where, for instance, this kind of content belongs? Does it actually tell us more about how the Second World War remembered in Russia? Or does it actually tell us more again about Russian propaganda or the Russian appropriation of history? And again, here are a few examples. I think that most of them can be actually relatively easy to understand even without a translation, but I would just translate two of those which are on the left. So on the left, you really see quite some fascinating, I would say, combination of the content. So on the one hand, you actually have the images, and here I'm speaking about the top left item. So you definitely see the images of assumingly Soviet soldiers who are actually aiming their guns on the very, I would say, stereotypical image of the gay parade, assumingly in one part of the Europe's. And then basically the signature tells, wait, Misha. And basically Misha is a very common Russian name. Let those bastards come closer, which pretty much, I would say, really reiterates a lot of tropes from the Russian propaganda about the corrupt West being really populated with the homosexuals and also trying to kind of enforce those terrible Western corruption on the Holy Orthodox Russia. But at the same time, it also, I would say, quite interestingly appropriates the memory of the Second World War and the assumed heroism of the Soviet soldiers in order to kind of really, I would say, push together those two different worlds of the Russia and also the West. And another interesting example is actually left bottom image, which actually shows one of the Ukrainian soldiers, Serhiy Volinsky, who was captured at the Azovstal and recently liberated during the prisoner exchange. And if you're also familiar with the German history, you also can recognize the second person who is sitting on the chair. It is basically one of the German Second World War general, who is actually asking Volinsky, "So, grandson, did your Führer actually help you?" And as you can guess, the image of the Führer is pretty much to the right, which is the image of the Volodymyr Zelensky. Now, we talked quite a bit about the social media as online archives and complexities of actually operationalizing them as such. Now, let me actually talk a bit about the another very common perspective of social media platforms, now as information warriors. So we definitely recognize social media as quite important elements of propaganda and disinformation, as well as information warfare in general. Already for quite some time, there's really a lot of fascinating studies done on this topic, and here is just a couple of those which I really like a lot. We also know that social media platforms play quite important roles as information warriors because of the several reasons. Some of those reasons I already mentioned. First of all, them is easy access together with possibilities for remaining anonymous. So this is really a nice combination if you actually want to spread some false information or spread some propaganda. You definitely want to be able to do it easily and also staying unknown. Then social media definitely provide broad reach as well as low cost and high velocity of distribution. So again, it's very effective. You can very quickly disseminate content. You can really reach a very broad audience, both in your country and also outside. We're also knowing that social media supports multi-format content. So for instance, it's possible to combine text and image content to amplify the message. You actually saw some examples on the previous slides. And pretty much we're also knowing that specifically in the case of Russia, there is definitely quite a lot of effort on the side of Kremlin to actually facilitate the use of especially domestic platforms as a form of information warriors, using a combination of both legislation, but also ownership. So basically quite some of the social media platforms right now are already owned by the people who are very closely affiliated with the Kremlin, which pretty much results to those platforms being very intensively used and appropriated for spreading disinformation propaganda. However, again, I would say that there are certain challenges which actually don't necessarily allow us to kind of put our finger on social media platforms and say, okay, it's only about information warfare. We just probably can simply ban Kontakte and Telegram, and then our life would be fascinating, and we all would be living very happily all together. So pretty much what we're actually arguing together with colleagues is that even while there is definitely a very close relationship between social media and propaganda, especially in the context of war in Ukraine, there is still some aspects which actually make us a bit harder to define this relationship in detail. So one of those aspects which is important in this case is that even while we know that the state-influenced domestic platforms, again, think about Kontakte, are very likely to offer the interpretation of the ongoing war, which is actually aligning with the Kremlin narrative. Our empirical research shows that it's actually not necessarily that simple and that the reality might actually be a bit more nuanced. This is another nice graph. I definitely like very different colors here, which actually comes from a recent paper that we actually completed with my excellent colleague, Alexander Uyman from the University of Zurich. What we actually did for this specific study, we actually were interested in what kind of content appears on the Russian social media platform Kontakte for the posts which actually contain the term special operation. And you can probably guess our expectations, because the special operation is basically the way how Kremlin refers to its aggressive and ridiculously bloody war in Ukraine. So pretty much I would say that there is no sane person who actually would call the war in Ukraine special operation unless it is really a propagandist or person who actually believes Russian propaganda. So pretty much what we expected is that pretty much the data set that we would collect would be very much dominated by the propaganda narrative. But what we found quite interesting is that it's not necessarily turned out to be the case in all cases. We definitely observe quite strong presence of the messages which actually promote and reiterate the Kremlin narrative. But what we found very interesting is that actually the quite big chunk of messages, and they're marked by the red line on the graph, actually serves a purpose which is actually quite different from the Kremlin propaganda. So basically what the red line shows you is the presence of Vkontakte posts which actually discuss Russian casualties. So basically the stories of the individual soldiers which are killed in the Ukraine, which they actually try to capture. And on the one hand, you definitely can see how it would align with the Kremlin propaganda. You know, it definitely would not probably lose the possibility to talk about the heroism of our boys who are protecting the Holy Orthodoxy and the Russian vote in the terrible, corrupted Ukraine. But on the other hand, it's definitely not necessarily aligns with the idea of the war in Ukraine being a nice adventure where nobody on the Russian side is actually killed, which is certainly how the Russian propaganda very often tries to present the war. So in this case, we're actually seeing how the very, I would say, pro-state and pro-regime platform actually undermines quite to a certain degree the official narrative, which already complicates the whole idea of the Vkontakte being only a pro-Kremlin propaganda outlet. Another important feature that we actually find interesting in this case is that we also have quite intense contestation of the propaganda narratives, both on the Western but also on the domestic Russian platforms. And certainly happens between the, let's say, pro-Kremlin and also anti-Kremlin, for instance, pro-Ukrainian groups, but also, for instance, between the different groups or affiliated or actually interested in supported Kremlin. And there is really very quite interesting ongoing debacle right now. If you would be interested, I would love to actually tell you more during the Q&A, which actually concerns the ongoing conflict between the Russian Ministry of Defense and actually influential Russian bloggers, which are known as voyenkors or war correspondents or war journalists, even while I wouldn't necessarily call those people professional journalists, considering a lot of dubious ethical questions and choices they make. And here's one of the examples of this conflict. So basically what you can see on the screen is a tweet from Semyon Pegov, one of the influential Russian war journalists, who is very, very, I would say, pro-Kremlin. And basically what he writes here is that he says, according to Shoigu, which is the Russian Minister of Defense, we have around 6,000 killed. We do not know how it is for Shoigu, but we actually lost more people than Shoigu claims, which is, I would say, very outrageous thing to claim in the very, I would say, state control media environment. But we can see that actually pro-Kremlin people still using the social media platforms to actually, to a certain degree, disrupt this official narrative, which we find, again, pretty interesting when we think about the social platforms in the context of information warfare. And then there is one more challenge, which we are also struggling quite a lot in our own research for, I would say, for quite some years, is that it's really very hard for us to actually identify the target audience of the information warfare in the context of the social media. And pretty much it's really important because if we are concerned about the information warfare and the whole social media of information warriors, then we're having certain expectation about the impact on the people, which we expect to be negative. However, the challenge for us is actually to measure this impact. And for instance, in the same paper that I actually mentioned earlier with my great colleague Alexandria, we actually tried to think about the ways how we can actually understand who are the people who are listening, who are reading and writing of Vkontakte about the war in Ukraine as a special operation, and the ones who actually write about it as a war, which I would say is very much closer to the reality definition. And then we actually struggled with the fact that we do not necessarily really have that much reliable data coming from the platform. So some users, for instance, report the age or location, but we do not necessarily able to trust this kind of information. So in the end, we kind of looked at the subscription to the specific information communities on the platform. And if you would be interested in learning more about this one, and again, ask me some questions during Q&A, what I very briefly tell you is that pretty much, I would say the main difference that we observed, and there actually were not that much difference as we expected, is that the people who write about the special operation are definitely much more interested in propaganda channels. And some examples that you can see on the screen are, for instance, the IT Russia, the Tsargrad, so pretty much right-wing Russian media, or for instance, the Solovyov Life, which is another influential Russian TV anchor with very, I would say, right-wing views. So conclusions, and then I would luckily shut up and actually we would go to the questions. So what are the social media platforms in the context of the Russia's war? What we can actually tell about it based on our research? So we definitely can have an easy answer and we can have a hard answer. So if you go an easy route, and sometimes easy route can be quite nice, is that we can actually tell that social media in the context of Russia's war are both online archives and information warriors, because they definitely show us the feature of both. If you actually try to make it more complicated and going for the hard answer, then unfortunately the answer would be that they're neither. And this kind of ambiguity is really important to account when deciding on how we study these platforms, how we regulate these platforms, and generally how we use these platforms, again, both as a scientist and also as a citizens. There are definitely some ongoing developments which actually try to kind of diminish this ambiguity. And again, I would be really very happy to talk more about those if you're interested in. So for instance, in the context of the archives, we're definitely thinking that even while, for instance, social media platforms per se are really not necessarily the perfect archives, we still probably can actually make nice traditional archives based on their content. And here I would actually guide you through the fascinating archiving work project, which is led by Taras Nazaruk from the Lviv Center of the Urban History. I think that you also have someone from the center as part of the lecture series. And pretty much what the Taras is actually thinking about is actually to downloading the content coming from social media platforms into a different environment when it actually would be possible, for instance, to provide attribution, moderate access. So for instance, the horrible content which dehumanizes certain people actually not publicly visible, but actually still accessible for the researchers. And in this case, we can probably actually address certain challenges actually discussed. Similarly, in the context of the information warfare, we're knowing that quite some platforms, including, for instance, Telegram, which was quite unexpected, actually starts to even enforce a bit more, I would say, filtering of the problematic content. For instance, certain Telegram channels which actually openly promote violence, murdering the prisoners, war crimes, and so on and so forth, and actually tries to ban this kind of channels. The problem is, of course, that this kind of channels are still quite quickly to remade, but still it might actually show us that in the end, there is a possibility of actually limiting the information warfare aspect of social media. The question is we really actually willing to do this and what we actually need to do? However, and this is my last point, what it actually shows us all together is that the question of what platforms can and will be in the context of contemporary war still remains open. I would argue we still need a lot of more research coming from academia, but also from the civil society, and also a lot more discussion about what we as citizens, I would say both in Switzerland, but also in Ukraine, actually want the social media platforms to be, and how we can actually expect their role in many societal processes that we're experiencing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mykola, for your fascinating talk. We already have a question in the chat. I have also a lot of questions. Maybe I'll start with one and then I'll read the one from the chat, and people can continue chipping in and giving more questions. You said that there were, concerning social network sites, there were censorship efforts as well as from the Russian side as well as from the Ukrainian side. So I guess lots of our listeners will also be interested to learn how these efforts compare. Yeah, if they're different in quality, or what can you say about this?
Yes, thank you, Matthias. It's an excellent question. And also, we can definitely talk about it for a very long time. So let me just try to answer relatively quickly. I would say that there are definitely certain similarities. Probably just because, there are only so many ways you can actually do the online censorship. So you don't necessarily having that much, I would say, possible implementations available. We know that, for instance, in the case of Ukraine, there were some platforms banned, specifically the platforms which were actually recognized as potentially threatening in terms of the spreading Russian propaganda. So pretty much I would say that two primary examples are the VKontakte ban in 2017, as well as the majority of the Yandex services ban in the same year. In the case of Russian, you again have quite a lot of Western platform bans, especially after the beginning of the intense phase of the war following the February 2022, which actually indeed aim to limit the access of the Russian citizens to actually information which is not, I would say, promote the pro-Kremlin narrative. It also, I would say, very vividly shows the kind of normative difference between censorship in both cases. You can definitely, I would say, ask to what degree the Ukrainian authorities' desire to ban Russian platforms was 100% focused just on the genuine desire to protect population from the Russian propaganda. I would say that yes, there might be some additional reasons, but pretty much the protection of the propaganda and kind of the really stopping the potential distortion of the public sphere is still a really important factor in this one. In the case of the Russian censorship effort, we definitely know that the main motivation is kind of to help Mr. Putin to sit on his throne and actually to prevent the Russian citizens from actually getting access to higher quality and also more critical information, which definitely damages the public sphere way, way, way more than the Ukrainian public sphere might potentially be damaged by banning the Russian platforms. So I would say in terms of implementation, you're definitely having quite a lot of similarities. In terms of the normative impact and also the motivation behind the bans, I would argue you really have a lot of differences.
I have a follow-up question. As you, I think, in one of the studies you briefly also showed us, you actually came to the conclusion that the ban, ironically, that the ban of Kontaktje was maybe not unnecessary because the pro-Ukrainian partisan content was much more widespread than the pro-Russian content. Mm-hmm. Would you also say that to what degree is a propaganda effort on social networking sites really important for the mm-hmm. Kremlin? Is it as compared to the traditional media? Is the effort mm-hmm. very great, or is it still like people are reached mainly by TV and so on?
Thank you again, Matthias. This is such an excellent question, and also there is so many things to unpack. Let me again try to do it relatively briefly. I would say that probably I will start from the end and the part concerning really the impact of the social media propaganda, especially in Russia. The honest answer is that it's really hard for us to kind of tell, give here an answer with kind of 100% certainty. Again, because of the reasons that I mentioned, it's really quite hard for us to actually understand the empirical impact of the propaganda on social media. We're really struggling for many reasons, starting that Russia is kind of not really the most welcoming environment for conducting this kind of research right now, and honestly was not for quite some years already. Second, that it's really actually quite hard for us to actually, I would say, even operationalize this kind of impact. Probably we can do something with experimental research, but it requires quite some fund. And also quite some, I would say, thinking about whom we actually recruit and for whom it's actually the most relevant. And then if we kind of look at, I would say, some implicit signals, then probably we can suggest that, yes, probably the traditional media such as TV might be actually more important venue for the propaganda in Russia until now. Because we definitely know that at least based on some recent survey results, which again should be really taken with some grain of salt, that really people who tend to support the regime the most are also the ones that primarily use traditional media and do not necessarily social media to actually inform themselves. So we might actually have this potential correlation. Definitely not a causation. We would need really to put much effort to kind of prove the causal relationship here. But we kind of can guess that probably traditional media is more important in this case. At the same time, what is really important about the social media is that what we're especially observing right now is that social media really becomes, I would say, the main vehicle of the most extreme propaganda, which is actually sometimes is actually picked up by the mainstream media in Russia. And it is really highly problematic because we know that really if you want to find the most hateful speeches, if you want to find the most dehumanizing content, you can easily find it on social media. It's definitely ahead of the mainstream media. But the problem is that at some point, mainstream media starts thinking, okay, we are lagging behind. Maybe we should actually take some of those terrible tropes, or at least kind of mention them to the main audience. And I would say it's really highly problematic. And concerning the first question about the actually ban of Kontakte, I would say it's really something that is quite heavily debated. I know that a lot of my great colleagues are actually having very strong opinions that yes, it was pretty much beneficial for the Ukrainian public sphere. I would say that yes, based on our findings, we still, for instance, observe quite strong presence of the pro-Ukrainian communities on social media. So in this case, it might actually give a bit more exposure for actually Russian citizens to the different point of view. But unfortunately, you always have this trade-off between actually protecting your public sphere and potentially giving more voice to your views in the other public sphere. So unfortunately, it's really very hard to tell what was the best way of doing this.
Thank you very much, Mykola. I will read now some of the questions we've received because there are already quite a lot. I will just read them as they have come in, I guess. Thanks for this informative talk. My questions, I think the first one is already being answered right now. How important are social media? Okay, we have answered that. Aren't the social media systems in Ukraine and Russia very different? For instance, very different proportions of using Facebook versus Kontakt here. Aren't there very discrepant developments of content on the same platforms in Russia and Ukraine? And what is the role of regulations and filters versus algorithms? E.g., Norwegian researchers study. Okay, that's somebody who knows his shit, I guess. So maybe you could address this question briefly.
Yeah, surely. And thanks a lot for the excellent question. Again, I would say questions because there are definitely quite some, and they're really very interesting and also honestly quite hard to respond. So let me again try to do it relatively quickly. The question number 2 about the difference of social media systems in Ukraine and Russia. Yes, absolutely. They're definitely quite different. The difference, I would argue, was substantially less before 2017 and the ban of the Russian platforms. After the 2017, there really become quite, I would say, major discrepancies, which were again very much amplified by the bans of Western platforms in 2022. But you're absolutely right. In Ukraine right now, there is definitely quite stronger emphasis on the Western platforms, such as Facebook or Twitter, whereas in the case of Russia, for Russian citizens, there is not much possibilities anymore to actually access the Western platforms. They still can access, but I know that quite some colleagues from Russia actually openly afraid of doing this right now because I think UK, they already recognize as extremist organizations, for instance, Meta. So right now, I am not an extremist because I'm using my Facebook account, but who knows what actually would become tomorrow. So yes, there is definitely quite a lot of differences. It's absolutely something that is important to acknowledge when talking about the role of social media in the both context.
Okay.
And yes.
Yeah, no, carry on.
Yeah. And the question about the discrepant developments of the content as well as the content regulation, I would say it's really a fascinating question. It's absolutely something that we actually would like to look more in our research. And pretty much I would say that the algorithms we are already trying to do something, but we still need to actually find time to sit and really focus in a very concentrated manner on the potential algorithm-driven differences. For now, as Matthias again said, we are primarily working with the search engine algorithms, and we're definitely having some projects ongoing about the difference between Yandex and Google in terms of the representation of information about the war in Ukraine. In terms of the regulation, I'm not an information lawyer, so it's really a bit hard for me to give really a solid answer here. But I would say that back in days when I was looking into the whole topic, the regulation didn't necessarily really was that advanced, specifically in the case of the social media platforms, and especially the algorithmic affordances, which would potentially also include bots, which is really thrilling topic. So it might have changed in the very recent years. I would not necessarily think so, but if you have some additional info, I would be very glad to actually hear it from you. So hopefully it actually answers the question to a certain degree.
Thank you very much, Mykola. I want to say that this very informed question was by Jens Eder, because I do have the names here. The next one is by the very brief question is by Rito C. What do you think about NAFO? And maybe you could explain what NAFO is for lay people.
Okay, I was not really working that much with NAFO content. So again, it's super anecdotal evidence on my side. So pretty much, then again, the person who asked the question would likely know more, so they would be able to actually correct me in the chat. So pretty much NAFO is kind of an online activist group, which I would say is has a pro-Western, pro-Ukrainian alignment, and which produces some fascinating, I would say, mimetic content with the funny dogs in military uniforms, which actually pretty much in some cases exposing the ridiculousness of Russian propaganda, pretty much promoting the more pro-Western interpretation of the conflict. I personally think that they're great. Again, I have not really made research specifically on this type of online community, but I really I would say, encountered their content quite often. It's really hard not to encounter it. And I would say that especially in the Anglophone environments. In the Russian-speaking and Ukrainian-speaking communities, I didn't necessarily saw that much content from NAFO, but basically in the accounts and the communities which discuss the war in Ukraine in the West, there's quite a lot of NAFO content, and I really find that it's quite interesting and really represents the war in a very creative way.
Thank you, Mykola. We have a lot of questions in the F&A section. Sarina asks, what do you think of efforts like #war translated or #rebar EN who translate Russian contents and propaganda for a Western audience? Should this content be included in quote archives or considered for research as well, or would it count as duplicated content?
Thanks a lot. This is another great question. I would say that the answer would definitely depend on the person who is leading the archival effort. I am personally really very much fascinated by the multilingual research, as well as the impact that the language has on the representation of the same societal issues or subjects. So I would say if I would be kind of leading the archival effort, I would probably include both because there might be some nuances in the representation. We know that in some cases, we can expect that the translation of the Russian propaganda into English might be slightly different from the Russian original. And it would be really interesting to understand whether or not the differences are systematic, whether or not they're more random, what kind of semantics is behind those differences. So probably if I would have time and effort, I would actually try to include both, because I definitely see some interesting research questions which can be actually answered using the comparison.
Thank you, Mykola. An anonymous listener asked, could you maybe just quickly describe what exactly is meant with echo chambers?
Yeah, I will just do it super quickly. Again, probably if you would be interested in echo chamber in detail, you might really want to ask my great colleague, Alexander Ullmann from Zurich, who was really working on the subject way more than me. But pretty much the idea of the echo chamber is that the social media as well as digital platforms in general might lead to the formation of the closed ideological communities, where you basically have reiteration of the same ideological viewpoints. For instance, the West is terrible, the Russia is great, or that the war in Ukraine is justified. And because the people in those communities actually do not necessarily have access to the external viewpoints or the external opinions, then they have kind of this problem of reiterative exposure to the same ideas and the viewpoints again, which kind of indeed leads to some kind of echo, which repeats itself for many cycles. And pretty much one of the big concerns about the echo chambers in this context is that indeed the possibility of the radicalization. So you're starting from the point A, and then you kind of again, getting exposed to the same kind of messages, sometimes often quite radical. And then at the end you become radicalized, which is really quite a big danger, which is also shall be considered in the context of social media.
Mykola, is echo chamber used synonymously with filter bubbles, or do you have to distinguish these terms?
That's a great question, Matthias. You know, we spent so many discussions with the colleagues on this one.
Okay.
I would say that personally, if you would ask me, I would say yes, I would probably differentiate those. So at least for me, the echo chamber is more of a larger concept, whereas the filter bubble at least again for me, is kind of more a sub-concept of the echo chamber. So the idea of the filter bubble is kind of the algorithm-driven echo chamber. So basically, the echo chamber where the people within the echo chamber are very much kept inside by the algorithmic recommendations. So think, for instance, by the Facebook feed really promoting you only pro-Russian content because either the algorithm malperforms or because it really thinks that you're heavily into the pro-Russian content, and then you're kind of getting into this filter bubble, which is a form of the echo chamber.
Okay, so the echo chamber would be rather reflective of this personal behavior, and the filter bubble more on the side of the information environment? Or?
Absolutely, at least for me, yes.
Okay, so I'll read another question. Another anonymous question: how do you know whatever is published is accurately reflecting reality and truth? Well, here in the Western world, we have reliable sources like Reuters. Are there similar reliable sources in Russia that are not influenced or controlled by the regime? So there's a question about if there's still independent sources of information in Russia, which is also an important question, I guess. Thank you.
Yeah, this is really a great question. I would say that, again, there is quite a lot of debate, both, I would say, within the Russians themselves, but also for people who study Russian information environment, what you actually treat as independent to reliable source. I would say it's definitely quite a challenging, I would say, question to actually deal with. Personally, I would say that there are certainly some Russian independent journalistic outlets which I follow, and which I would say can be viewed as certainly way more reliable than, let's say, pro-Kremlin outlets. So, for instance, I'm following Novaya Gazeta Europe edition as well as Meduza. So, at least in my view, I think that these outlets doing solid journalistic job. But at the same time, I also know that quite some Russian colleagues, for instance, are not necessarily that supportive of those two outlets, and also find the reasons to critique. But also, I would say that even in the case of the Western journalistic outlets, unfortunately, there are cases when there is well-deserved criticism. So I would say that it really depends on how you define reliable and what kind of expectations you actually have for any kind of materials coming from it.
Thank you, Mykola. The next question is I think, up the same alley. It's which social platforms can I trust these days, especially during conflicts? Maybe that's about your personal use of media. And then there are rumors that Instagram deletes Iran protests and Russian resistance posts and videos that are regime critical. What do you think about it? So that's a question especially about one platform, Instagram, and its compliance to state censorship efforts, I think.
Thanks a lot. Another fascinating questions, and the ones that which are really quite hard to respond. I would start with the first one. For the trust towards social platforms, let me be honest, I would not necessarily trust any social platforms these days. It's probably very pessimistic, but it's kind of just sad reality. I would really say that it's important to kind of take almost all type of content which is coming from them with a lot of grain of salt, and also very, I would say, critically see what is coming there, as well as think about who actually produces content, who disseminated it, what kind of agendas it might actually have. I know that personally, I'm following a lot of Telegram channels, but I definitely would not trust Telegram channels. And I also know that, again, to kind of get a better idea of what is happening, I'm following both pro-Ukrainian but also Russian propagandist channels, which is, again, both for the reasons of my personal research, because I actually have to understand what is going on, but also because, again, I really would struggle with finding a single source of information these days, especially in the context of war in Ukraine, which I would actually push my finger on and tell, okay, I 100% trust this source. So unfortunately, it's really quite sad reality. We really have to be very critical towards the information which is coming, especially from the social media. And pretty much I already talked about the reasons why it happens. In the case of the Instagram question, I actually do not necessarily know much about this specific performance of the Instagram. Again, as Matthias said, we are primarily looking at the censorship either in the context of the search engines or in the context of the non-Western platforms. But unfortunately, I would not be able to fully exclude this possibility. We know from our research that there are cases when Western platforms actually complying with the requirements of the rather authoritarian regimes. Again, we actually saw it in the case of the Google and Yandex during the Russian elections in last year. But in this specific case, I would actually need to do research in order to be able to answer it reliably. However, I would not be surprised if Instagram would do this.
Thank you very much, Mykola. The second to last question we have is, what do you think of Zelensky's presence on social media compared to Putin's? Maybe that's also a question about what content you have encountered. I guess you you have analyzed a lot of content, so maybe you can say something about the representation of these national leaders.
Absolutely, and it's another great question. I would say that kind of the presence should be relatively easy to answer. Zelensky is definitely present on the social media. For Putin's presence, I would not say that it's really something that just comes directly from the Putin. We definitely know having a lot of Putin-related content on the social media, as well as, let's say, the video records of Putin, but I would not really call it a personal presence on the social media. And it's definitely something that I think really differentiates Zelensky and Putin a lot in this case. Personally, in my view, from the point of view actually spreading the message and also communicating to the social media audience, Volodymyr Zelensky is definitely way more effective, which is, again, not unexpected considering both the age difference, the different, I would say, backgrounds of the two peoples. And in the terms of the content related to those two figures on the social media, I would say you definitely can find a lot of very funny, but also very horrible content dealing with both. So it really depends on what kind of channel or what kind of social media community you're actually looking for. But in terms of the personal presence, I would say that naturally the presence of Zelensky is much stronger, and also I would say way more integrated into the social media platforms than in the case of Putin.
Thank you very much, Mykola. We have still questions coming in. Anya Gada writes, I just wrote an essay on the Belarusian group cyber partisans who sabotage physical facilities to disrupt the war. Have you also heard of cyber activists who try to sabotage the digital space to prevent the Kremlin from spreading propaganda?
I would say it's a great question. Definitely also something that we would love to research more with the colleagues, something that we have not researched that much yet, unfortunately, but hopefully in the upcoming years. I would say that yes, we definitely heard quite some things about both individual and also collective groups which are actually aiming to disrupt Kremlin propaganda. There are also definitely a lot of, I would say, very creative ways of doing so. There was already a question about NAFO. So we definitely can think about the communities which are actually using the satire or the humor to actually spread the anti-propagandist messages, which are actually aiming to undermine the Kremlin propaganda. You can actually think about, I would say, very direct attempts for actually causing the malfunction of the propaganda outlets, such as DDoSing them. We know that especially in the beginning of the intense phase of the war in February, March, quite a number of Ukrainian activists were involved in this kind of activities. We're also knowing about, for instance, about the ways of using online advertisements to actually spread the anti-propaganda messages, which actually tells that, okay, what is happening in Ukraine is not special operation where people greeting Russian soldiers with roses. It's actually the aggressive war where Russian people actually murdering Ukrainian civilians. And I personally think that it was really very creative way of actually implementing it, but kind of embedding this kind of messages into the online ads and then actually making platforms, for instance, such as Google, but you can also think, for instance, about the online cinemas to actually promote this kind of messages. So there's definitely a lot of things which are done, and I would say it's definitely something that is very much important to study more, and where there is so much more things to do.
Thank you very much. We have loads of questions. It's amazing. Sarina Vaishali Bomberger-Frey writes, can the nature of social media exposure also lead to a problematic telenovazation of war in this case? In what case? So I don't exactly know what it refers to. Maybe Sarina wants to come in and explain it. If not, we will go. We'll just skip the question maybe, and Sarina come in if she wants to.
I think that Sarina clarified it. And Sarina, can you super quickly also clarify what exactly do you mean by telenovazation? So I would make sure that actually responding it properly. And potentially we can actually go to the next questions and jump in.
Okay, so another question by Jens Eder. What might be the most influential channels, profiles on social media in Ukraine and Russia? Are there certain influencers dominating the field?
This is a great question. Again, something that I would really need to do a lot more research on to actually be able to respond 100% certainty. I definitely always prefer to respond to these kind of questions when actually having solid statistics. I would say that just based on my own exposure to the information about war in Ukraine, then on the Ukrainian side, you can definitely think about Volodymyr Zelensky. So I really think that he's probably one of the key influencers in communicating the war both to the West, but also to the Ukrainians. You're also definitely having some other quite, I would say, influential people in the Ukrainian media sphere. Think, for instance, about Alexei Arestovich or Mikhailo Podolyak. These are people who are affiliated with the presidential office. And I also know that some people are criticizing them quite a lot for different reasons, but I would still say that their, I would say, comments in the social media platforms are really quite important for actually representing and interpreting the war and also communicating it to the different kinds of audiences. In the case of Russia, I would say that it might be a bit more complicated because I personally have a bit of a distorted view on the matter. I can imagine that quite some people might get informed about the war based on, for instance, official reports of the Russian Ministry of Defense. But also we know that those reports are often so ridiculously boring and so far-fetched that at some point it really becomes hard to trust even for hardcore supporters of the regime. At the same time, we definitely having quite, I would say, a number of more grassroots influencers, especially on the Telegram. And I also mentioned some of those. They are often referred to as war correspondents, war journalists. You can indeed think, for instance, about Zepergov or Voenkoy Kotyonok. You also have more anonymous actors such as Rubar. And then there's also a question, for instance, how much they're actually affiliated with the regime. Unfortunately, it's really hard for us to, for instance, prove reliably whether or not they're paid by the Minister of Defense, whether or not they're paid by the certain political figures around the Putin. But I would say that they're pretty much influential. So I would say that there are definitely quite a number of influential channels and influential figures who actually, I would say, to a certain degree, shaping how the war is narrated and also documented. But it's again something that definitely would benefit from having more research on.
I mean, from having looked at some of your articles, one tends to get the impression that actually a few posts actually have like a majority of the clicks. Yeah, that it's quite concentrated sometimes. No, yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. So the last question we have. Again, by an anonymous listener. Today I saw a sequence of a clip with people on the street in some Russian city being asked what they thought of Putin's attacks on Ukrainian cities. Most of the respondents thought it good as a means of revenge for the bombing of the Kerch Bridge, which they perceived as an atrocity. It appeared as most of the people sort of accepted state TV as the truth. What percentage of the Russian population would participate in such a forum as we are having here? So how are they? Would they even be prepared or ready to have such a discussion? I guess.
would say it's an excellent question. And I would also try to answer both this one and also the question of Sarina, because I also saw the clarification of the concept. So first, for the questions that Matthias just read, I would say it's a question that is super hard to answer. First of all, it's basically need to decide, can we actually talk about some collective Russian who is actually has very established media diet and very established view on the war, which in my view would be the case for the certain groups of the Russian population, but for others it probably would not. And especially when we're actually dealing with the kind of the content that was noted in the question, indeed this kind of supportive clips with, let's say, assumingly random people on the street who telling, okay, it's so fun to kill all Ukrainians, go Russia. There's always a question, do we actually know if those people are random? How they were actually sampled? Are they just the friends of the person who's actually shooting the video? I would say that it's really the same, pretty much I would say there's the same problems that we're struggling when we think about the survey research in the case of Russia, which is so severely limited by so many factors, starting with the self-censorship and ending with the survey companies being disproportionately influenced by the Kremlin and then simply producing often the results that Kremlin wants to see. But in this case, I would say it's even more radical. So I would not necessarily say that we can actually say that all Russians would kind of hate the events that we are having right now. Some definitely would hate, especially the ones which are really constantly exposed to the propaganda, who really trust propaganda, which is unfortunately, we can expect quite a big part of the population. But I would not necessarily say that we can say that everyone in Russia is really 100% brainwashed. I would say that it's a bit far-fetched. And concerning the question about the social media and telenovazation, I really struggle with pronouncing this one. I definitely think that it's valid concern. I think that specifically some research on the media effects and media exposure, as well as, for instance, the experience of trauma and re-traumatization on the social media might be really interesting to check in this case. Again, it's not necessarily my strongest piece of cake, but I would expect that, yes, the more we actually expose to the on social media to the images of the violence, the more to a certain degree we kind of getting used to it. I personally know that I still, for instance, have certain, I would say, images or stories that still trigger me heavily. But at the same time, for instance, my, I would say, general triggering of some of the images that I would find, let's say, very shocking in 2012, before the Russian war actually started in 2014, do not necessarily trigger me anymore. And the same problem is indeed kind of refers to this perception of the war as a show, especially when you're kind of really focusing on, I would say, representations which kind of really present the less ugly and less graphic aspects of the war. It is pretty much unavoidable. If you kind of expose to more nice images of, let's say, beautiful shooting rockets, beautiful planes, beautiful tanks only, you would not necessarily think about the human cost of the war, which is really terrible in the case of the Ukraine. So yes, it is definitely a risk. We can also expect that for quite some people, this type of exposure might be prevalent, especially I would say probably to a certain degree in Western countries where you do not necessarily really feeling that the war directly affects your life. But for some, it's definitely also not the case.
Thank you very much. As there are no more questions right now, I would like to maybe round the discussion up a little bit. We had lots of great questions with great details, also very informed questions. Maybe I can ask a little bit a broader question, maybe. So one of the studies you briefly accessed in your talk was the one about the presentation of the Ukrainian conflict in 2014, and there I think that the concern was a lot if you have like a segregation of Ukraine and of the Ukrainian public, so it's becoming news consumption very partisan. Are people in these echo chambers, as we have mentioned, and that was the worry then, I guess. And since the beginning of the brutal invasion of Ukraine by Russia in February, this worry of partisanship and might be overridden in the minds of people by the fear of Kremlin propaganda and disinformation. I think we've seen that the interest is huge in your research because it's a very current research, and it also has highly political implications. So maybe you want to say something more general about how the dramatic developments of the years, or maybe especially February, the Russian invasion, how this has influenced you in the way you have framed your research questions. How have they shifted within the last years, as you have also observed this war as a researcher, as well as a Ukrainian citizen?
Thank you so much. This is an excellent question, Matthias. And also, again, honestly, one that is really hard to answer. It really would require a lot of reflection. So again, let me try to kind of respond it briefly. I would say that probably from 2022, especially the February, both me and colleagues kind of started recognizing that the urgency of what we are studying is even higher than we thought about. Because before 2022, I would say the conflict was more or less frozen. We were definitely having quite substantial talks about the Russian propaganda, about the disinformation, about the manipulation of the public sphere. But again, I would say that it was not necessarily something that really results in the deaths of dozens, thousand people and really terrible amount of the destruction. So I think in this sense, really the new phase of the war kind of make us think, okay, what we are doing is probably even more urgent than what we were doing before, that probably we need to be even more rigorous in what we are doing, because it's really essential for us to understand those processes and also understand how we can prevent it. Because I would say that even while we do not necessarily having the reliable measurement of the impact of the propaganda and disinformation, again, we have some assumptions about its, I would say, role. So for instance, one of the, I would say, differences that we definitely observe between 2014 and 2022 is really much more extreme forms of the pro-Russian propaganda and really much stronger focus on the dehumanization of Ukrainians. So definitely something that we observed to a certain degree in 2014, but then it was really much more formulated as, okay, our Slavic brothers just become the slaves of the Nazi regime in Kiev, we have to liberate them, blah, 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 blah. In 2022, it really becomes very different story, especially as the war goes. Instead of Slavic brothers, we are talking about the Ukrainian pigs from whom we actually have to liberate our holy Russian lands. And I would say that, again, we do not really have a strong, I would say, causation here, but at least in my personal view, again, both as a researcher and as citizens, I see that this kind of dehumanization also contributes quite a bit to the Russian war crimes, which are committed right now in Ukraine on a very larger scale than they were committed in 2014. Again, we already had war crimes in 2014, but now the scale is just really incomparable. And I would say that it actually really one of the strong emphasis of why we actually need to do this research, why we actually need to talk more about how we're treating platforms, how we're preventing this kind of abuse of the platforms to spreading propaganda, disinformation. So yes, I would say that basically, I would not necessarily say that the war really changed things dramatically for me as a researcher. So it's not that I suddenly was sitting and saying, okay, I never thought about it before. I really have some fascinating paper idea I have to read. But what it really did for our colleagues, it really emphasized how important what we are doing, is that we actually need to do it even better and actually talk even more to the people about the implications of what we are doing.
Thank you very much. Maybe I can expand on that topic of disinformation. Our institute has just recently launched a research project about disinformation in the arts. So this notion of disinformation is very interesting to us. Maybe you can summarize a little bit where else you have touched upon the problem with disinformation in your research, and also how you conceptualize disinformation. Maybe you also wanted to say what you find promising in your field, maybe you will also want to say what is really tough when trying to conceptualize disinformation, because I guess it's quite hard to conceptualize when you're working with statistics and like in a positivist manner. Maybe.
Absolutely, Matthias. Thank you so much. This is such a great question, and definitely the one I can talk for a very long time. I would say that you're totally right. Pretty much, I would argue that, in my view, really probably the core problem of studying disinformation is its conceptualization first, and then operationalization second. Because on the one hand, the disinformation is really not that hard to conceptualize. So it's basically the false information which is spread with a certain malicious intent. But already in this very short definition, which is kind of classic in a lot of social sciences and also in the field that we are working, you're having at least one very big problem that is very, very notoriously hard to define, which is, unsurprisingly, intent. Because when we're actually seeing some false information, let's say on the social media, then we can potentially prove that it is false. In some cases, it might be tough, especially, for instance, when it's information related to the war, when we're actually having a lot of, I would say, frontline censorship. We have a lot of problems with actually, for instance, unbiased reporting on the war. We're actually having a lot of problems with verification of the facts. But let's say we still somehow prove that it is false. And then we have a question, does it actually intentionally false? And it is, I would say, where the problems start, because in order to understand that it is intentionally false, you actually have to talk to the person who is spreading false information and ask, okay, dear person, are you actually aware that the information is A, false, and B, that you're actually spreading it in order to advance certain agendas? And I would say it's definitely something that we're struggling quite a lot. So we definitely, there are definitely a lot of, I would say, effort in actually countering disinformation, also detecting it. I really think that, for instance, journalistic fact checkers are really doing excellent work on this one. It's definitely also done in the case of the war in Ukraine. At the same time, it's also very realistically hard to kind of fact check everything, because the disinformation is coming. It's really endless stream. I also know that, for instance, in our own research, we also working on the automated detection of disinformation, where if you're, for instance, trying to teach the artificial intelligence to actually identify false information, and then actually tell us, okay, this claim is false, this claim is true. Just to kind of spoil you a bit, we're still far from success, let's be honest. We're getting somewhere. And for instance, we can teach the computer to kind of recognize more or less established types of the false information, especially when they have, let's say, very clear linguistic cues, such as, a lot of exclamation marks, a lot of sensationalist language. So this one we can potentially do, but kind of do it 100% reliably and also accommodate for the changes in the misinformation is extremely hard. That's why I'm also so happy to actually hear that you're actually going to look on it on your side, and also from a fascinating perspective, because I really think that humanities can bring so many interesting insight into actually research of the false information, both in terms of the knowledge of the mediums where the disinformation is spread, but also I would say in terms of the much more complex, I would say, normative and also critical perspective on what is false information, for whom it is false information, how we actually define universal falsehood. So I would be really watching what you're doing in Zurich. I really hope that you actually be getting the results relatively soon. So,
thank you very much for this very distinguished, sophisticated answer. Great to hear his perspective from that. I think we're losing people. I think we have a time until 8 officially. It's not like 7:45. I think we have time until 8. I would still, there's not no more questions come in. I would maybe ask the last question just to round it up, and then we can all have a well-deserved Feierabend. Maybe the last question I have, you already mentioned that this war is especially, maybe unfortunately also, because we live in a Eurocentric world, and there's definitely a lot more attention paid to this war than to other very bloody conflicts in the war. You also mentioned that the internet penetration is very high. So, and then I guess there's also there's also lots of money flows, I guess, going into research. Would you expect that this, what you call this kind of special situation also, what do you expect to the outcome for your field of research? Is this going to, I mean, it sounds a little bit cynical to ask the question, but maybe it's still an interesting one. Do you expect this war will be like mean a major step of progress in your field of research? Do you expect that?
Thank you very much, Matthias. I would really try to respond this fascinating question briefly also, because I think that's still very old that we actually had to finish in 1945. So I would be really fast. I would say that I definitely expect some really interesting advancements, simply because much more research would be done on the subject than, let's say, a year ago. I am asked to review for some conferences as well as the journals, and I definitely see that the amount of articles as well as conference proceedings which are submitted really grows quite quickly. So in this sense, I am certainly optimistic. We definitely would have more interesting studies on the disinformation propaganda coming out. And I would expect that probably some findings which are applicable to the case of Ukraine can actually be transferable for the other less studied cases. And hopefully would actually learn more about those less studied cases, because I totally agree, there is definitely quite some bias in how visible are the discussions of the impact of the technology on the different kinds of armed conflict. I do not think it should be the case. So hopefully we would actually see more interest also for other cases. At the same time, I might also be a bit skeptical about the, let's say, infrastructural changes, because I still have a feeling that we're still focusing a lot on the evil Russian propaganda and do not necessarily on the general media environment or the general platform environment, which in my view is something that is also very important to kind of consider, because we can, for instance, definitely try to ban the Russian propagandists. We definitely can try to cool the stream of the Russian propaganda. But will it, for instance, solve all the problems that we are struggling in terms of the social media platforms and their potentially disruptive, but also, for instance, positive effect on the public sphere? I personally do not think so. So really one of my hopes is that also the ongoing discussions of the Russian propaganda in the context of war in Ukraine would also kind of stimulate broader discussion about what is the general impact of social media on our societies, what is kind of vision of social media that we should have in, like, let's say 5 or 10 years, how we actually want to achieve or how we can achieve this vision. So far, I'm a bit skeptical, but I really would be very happy to kind of be disappointed in my skepticism. So definitely fingers crossed.
Okay, thank you very much, Mykola, for this answer and the big picture you have given us now. Sylvia has written that we actually had to stop at 7:45. I'm sorry for people who had to leave us right now. I think we had a great discussion. We thank so very much for joining us in this lecture series. And I guess we'll stay in touch also in Zurich and Bern. Yes. Thank you very much, and I think we'll close this
thank
meeting.
You so much for the great questions, and also huge thanks for the fascinating question, Matthias, as well as the moderation, and thanks one more for Sylvia and the team for the great events.
And thank you to the audience for the high participation and the great enthusiasm. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.